You can now take a hike in the water of beautiful Lake Tahoe. California state parks have developed Tahoe's first underwater trail. It's called the Emerald Bay State Park Maritime Heritage Trail. And it includes 4 different sites showcasing sunken historic boats.
Lake Tahoe is the kind of place that photographs better than anywhere else on Earth. Turquoise water, snow-dusted granite, a lake so clear that boats look like they're floating on air. For 60 years, scientists have been measuring exactly how far you can see into that water, and for 60 years, the answer has been slowly getting worse. That's not a legend. That's not a rumor whispered by old-timers in a marina bar. That's a peer-reviewed, published, 60-year dataset out of UC Davis. And it's just the beginning of a story about what's really underneath the most photographed lake in America. A story that turns out to be stranger and more human than the internet's version of it. Because here's the thing. In the past year, a very different Lake Tahoe story went viral. Millions of views. Titles like "Divers Found Something Terrifying," breathless narration about hundreds of leaking toxic barrels at 1,600 feet, preserve mob victims, an FBI cover-up, a record-shattering, 1-inch to 1,200-year drought that peeled back the water like a curtain. It had all the ingredients of a great campfire story. It also turned out to be almost entirely fabricated, and the real organizations named in it had to publicly say so. So let's do this properly. Let's talk about what Lake Tahoe actually is, what actually happened to it in the 20th century, what divers have actually found on the bottom, and why the true story of this lake's hidden depths is unsettling enough without anyone needing to invent barrels or bodies. Because the strange thing about Tahoe is that the real version of this story doesn't need embellishment to hold your attention. It has a genuine 60-year scientific paper trail. It has a real nonprofit that has spent years and thousands of volunteer dive hours mapping what's actually down there. It has a documented post-war pollution crisis that reshaped an entire region's environmental law. And it has a cautionary tale about how quickly a well-sourced true story can be hijacked, rewritten with AI narration, and turned into something the real scientists and divers involved had to publicly disown. That's arguably the more interesting mystery here. Not what's hiding at 1,600 feet, but how a fabricated version of that question managed to rack up millions of views before anyone official pushed back. Lake Tahoe sits at about 6,225 feet of elevation on the California-Nevada border, cupped inside a basin carved by geological faulting that began roughly 2 to 3 million years ago. It's the largest alpine lake in North America and the second deepest lake in the United States, reaching down more than 1,600 feet. Deep enough that only Oregon's Crater Lake goes further. The water rarely warms above the low 40s Fahrenheit, even in summer, cold enough to cause hypothermia in a swimmer within minutes. What makes Tahoe visually extraordinary is the same thing that makes it scientifically fragile, is an oligotrophic lake, meaning it is naturally low in nutrients and algae. The granite basin around it doesn't shed much sediment or organic material into the water, so historically there was very little to cloud it. That's why, in the late 1960s, researchers using a simple white disc called a Secchi disc, lowered by hand into the water until it disappears from view, could see it vanish at an average depth of about 97.4 feet. That number, from readings taken between 1967 and 1971, is still the benchmark every modern report gets measured against. The lake's purity was never permanent. It was a starting condition. And starting conditions are exactly the kind of thing that post-war America was not built to protect. It also helps to understand just how much water we're talking about because it explains why any change at Tahoe happens on a timescale most people don't have patience for. Tahoe holds an estimated 39 trillion gallons of water, enough, according to figures compiled by the U.S. Forest Service and the Tahoe Fund, to cover the entire state of California to a depth of roughly 14.5 inches. If you somehow drain the lake completely, the Forest Service estimates it would take around 700 years of natural inflow to fill it back up. A watershed that large doesn't respond to a single dry winter or even several. It has enormous thermal and hydrological inertia. That's part of why the 1-inch to 1,200-year drought claim in the viral videos was so easy to fact-check and so easy to disprove. A lake this size doesn't swing 9 feet in a single season based on one bad winter, and Turk's own long-term lake-level records simply don't show the event described. Real drought stress at Tahoe, when it happens, tends to show up gradually across multiple consecutive low snowpack years, not as a sudden dramatic reveal. That scale is also why the lake became such an attractive place to hide things from regulators in the first place. To anyone standing on the shore in 1955, Tahoe would have looked less like a lake and more like a geological feature, permanent, self-cleaning, too vast for anything dumped into it to ever matter. That assumption turned out to be wrong, but it took decades of scientific monitoring to prove it, because a lake that big doesn't show its damage quickly. It hides it slowly, in inches of lost clarity, measured one Secchi disk reading at a time. The viral version of this story leans hard on a real historical fact. Lake Tahoe changed almost overnight in the years after World War II. Before the war, the basin was remote and lightly developed, a handful of lodges catering to wealthy visitors, dirt roads that closed with the first heavy snow. Soldiers training in the region during the war got their first look at the lake, and when they came home with cars, GI Bill money, and an appetite for leisure, many of them came back. Nevada's legalized gambling accelerated the transformation on the lake's south and north shores through the 1950s and 1960s. Hotels, casinos, marinas, and subdivisions went up faster than any planning body could regulate them. And because environmental law in 1950s was essentially non-existent, the Clean Water Act didn't exist until 1972, and there was no coordinated basin-wide land use authority until the Tahoe Regional Planning Agency was created in 1969. Construction runoff, sewage, and development sediment went straight into streams that fed the lake with no meaningful oversight. This is not speculation. It's the documented reason TRC, the UC Davis Tahoe Environmental Research Center, exists at all. Researchers began systematically tracking Tahoe's clarity in 1968 specifically because they could already see it declining, and that early data became the scientific backbone for the bi-state compact that created the TRPA a year later. Water clarity kept falling through the rest of the 20th century, dropping most sharply through the late 1990s before leveling off at a plateau that has essentially held for the past 2 decades. The most recent Lake Tahoe Clarity Report, released in June 2025, put the annual average at 69.2 feet, clearer than the previous year's 62.3 feet, but statistically indistinguishable from the broader trend. In other words, still down nearly 30 feet from the lake's 1960s baseline, and stuck there. So the boom that buried it all isn't fiction. Tahoe really was transformed at reckless speed by post-war development, and the lake really has never fully recovered its original clarity. That part of the internet story didn't need to be exaggerated. It's already remarkable on its own. The other half of the viral narrative, hundreds of leaking industrial barrels, dozens of pristine 1950 sedans, preserved human remains, gets attributed to a real nonprofit called Clean Up the Lake, founded by a diver named Colin West, and to TRC itself. Both organizations exist. Both have done real, well-documented underwater work at Tahoe. Neither of them found what the viral video claims they found. Clean Up the Lake's actual story starts in 2019, when West and a team of volunteer divers set out to survey and clean the entire 72-mile shoreline of Lake Tahoe down to about 25 feet, a project they completed in 2021 and 2022, hauling out more than 20,000 individual pieces of debris and roughly 25,000 pounds of trash. That effort became the subject of a real documentary film, and it laid the groundwork for what the organization calls its second lap, the 72-mile deep clean, launched in December 2025, which pushes the survey down to depths of 35 to 55 feet using dive propulsion vehicles and enriched air nitrox to extend safe bottom time. Program's manager Jenny Uvira has said the team is finding hundreds of pounds of submerged litter on nearly every dive at these depths, and the organization projects the deeper phase could recover another 17,000 to 29,000 pounds of debris. What are they actually pulling up? Traffic cones, aluminum cans, fishing gear, car batteries, and, genuinely striking if less cinematic than a barrel graveyard, pieces of 4 Model T automobiles, axles, chassis sections, even a tire, remnants of vehicles that have been resting in the shallows since the earliest era of automobile tourism at the lake, nearly a century ago. West has described some of Tahoe's nearshore zones, 10 to 15 feet down, as looking closer to one of the dirtiest areas on Highway 80 than a postcard alpine lake, a reminder that even a lake famous for clarity has decades of ordinary human litter sitting just below where most swimmers ever look. Clean Up the Lake has since expanded that model to other freshwater lakes around the country, and its founder now hosts a docuseries called What Lies Unseen that documents the broader problem of submerged litter in American lakes. The idea, as West puts it, that these places have been out of sight and out of mind for decades. The methodology behind that work is worth understanding because it's the opposite of the dramatic ROV in total darkness imagery the viral videos lean on. Clean Up the Lake's divers work in teams, following pre-planned GPS transects along the shoreline, so the survey is systematic rather than random, logging every piece of debris they find, its type, its GPS location, and whether it's small enough to remove by hand or needs a heavier lift with surface support. Historical artifacts, aquatic invasive species sightings, and algal blooms get flagged and reported to the appropriate state and federal agencies rather than simply hauled out, because some of what divers find as scientific or historical value that's lost if it's just thrown away. It's slow, cold, unglamorous work, done mostly by volunteers in dry suits at depths where a wetsuit alone won't keep you warm for long, and has taken the organization the better part of a decade to survey a fraction of the lake's total underwater area. That's the real story, a genuinely long-running, methodical citizen science cleanup effort, real historical debris, and a real unglamorous truth about how much junk accumulates in a place people assume is pristine simply because the surface looks clean. Here's where this gets uncomfortable, because it says something about how these stories spread. In 2025 and 2026, a wave of YouTube videos began circulating with titles nearly identical to this one, claiming that a historic 2024 drought, described as the worst in 1,200 years, had dropped Tahoe's water level and exposed hundreds of corroded industrial barrels leaking heavy metals, dozens of well-preserved vintage cars, and most disturbingly, human remains linked to mob activity from a casino era, with footage supposedly withheld by the Washoe County Sheriff's Office and the FBI pending. Investigation. The Tahoe Daily Tribune investigated one of these videos directly and published its findings. Their reporting confirmed the video used an AI-generated narrator, real Tahoe footage, and TRC imagery stitched together with fabricated and out-of-context material, and, critically, quotes directly attributed to Colin West and Clean Up the Lake that the organization says were entirely invented. In a statement to the Tribune, Clean Up the Lake said it had no involvement in any ROV toxic barrel investigation, no involvement in any chemical analysis, and no involvement with law enforcement activity of the kind described in the video, stating plainly, none of these events occurred. A communications specialist at TRC was equally direct, telling the Tribune there was basically nothing in that video that's true, except that Lake Tahoe is here and there's water in it. Even the video's foundational premise doesn't hold up. The claim of a historic, worst in 1,200 years, 2024 drought is false. Turk's own State of the Lake reporting shows the lake was at normal to high water levels that year. There was no dramatic 9-foot drop exposing new shoreline. There was no drought-driven reveal at all. The entire inciting event of the viral story simply didn't happen. It's worth pausing on why this matters beyond just correcting the record. Lake Tahoe genuinely does have interesting, well-documented underwater history, real clarity decline, real post-war pollution, real debris fields, a real ongoing cleanup effort involving hundreds of volunteer dives. None of that needed embellishment to be compelling. Someone chose to manufacture a toxic waste and murder cover-up narrative on top of a true story that didn't require one, using real organizations' names and real researchers' credibility to sell it. That's a pattern worth recognizing anywhere you see it, not just at Tahoe. If you strip away the fabricated barrels and bodies, Lake Tahoe still has a real, ongoing environmental story, just a quieter, more bureaucratic one than a conspiracy thriller. The primary driver of clarity loss, according to Turk's decades of monitoring, is fine sediment particles suspended in the upper layers of the water, along with algae and phytoplankton blooms fed by nutrient runoff. Roads, urban development, and degraded streams and wetlands around the basin all contribute fine particles that cloud the water long before they ever settle to the bottom. Since the early 2000s, the Lake Tahoe Environmental Improvement Program, a coalition of more than 80 public and private organizations coordinated through the TRPA, has poured resources into projects meant to intercept that sediment before it reaches the lake, redesigned stormwater systems, restored wetlands, erosion control on roads, and ski areas. TRPA officials describe these investments as having genuinely slowed the decline, which is consistent with the plateau in clarity data since the early 2000s, even though the lake hasn't come close to recovering its historic transparency. Aquatic invasive species are the other persistent threat. Non-native organisms like Asian clams and quagga and zebra mussels have established themselves in parts of the basin over the past 2 decades, and once established, they're notoriously difficult to eradicate. Mussels in particular can filter feed in ways that alter nutrient cycling and clarity dynamics, and their shells can foul boats, docks, and water infrastructure. Boat inspection stations around the lake, exists specifically because of this risk, a much less dramatic form of something in the water than a leaking chemical drum, but one with real, measurable ecological consequences that scientists are actively trying to manage. Every trailer boat entering Tahoe is required to pass through one of these inspection stations where crews check hulls, ballast tanks, and bilges for hitchhiking mussels or clam larvae before a vessel is ever allowed to launch, a direct, permanent response to lessons learned at other western reservoirs where invasive mussels arrived once and never left. It's worth putting the fabricated creature angle of these viral videos in context too, because Tahoe already has a real, homegrown legend that long predates any of this. Locals have told stories about a large, unidentified creature in the lake, often nicknamed Tahoe Tessie, since at least the 1800s. It has never been backed by physical evidence, no verified photograph, no recovered remains, no scientific documentation, and serious researchers treat it the same way they treat any unconfirmed cryptid sighting, as folklore rather than biology. What keeps the story alive isn't evidence. It's the same gap that makes fabricated barrel and body videos so easy to believe. A lake more than 1,600 feet deep, with a floor almost nobody has actually seen with their own eyes, leaves plenty of room for imagination to fill in what documented science hasn't reached yet. To put the scale of that restoration effort in perspective, the Lake Tahoe Environmental Improvement Program isn't a single grant or a one-time cleanup fund. It's a coordinated, decades-long partnership between the states of California and Nevada, the federal government, local jurisdictions, and dozens of private organizations, all funding overlapping projects: stormwater treatment facilities, stream and wetland restoration, forest health, and wildfire risk reduction. Since severe wildfire smoke and ash are themselves a documented source of fine particles reaching the lake and habitat work along the shoreline. It represents one of the longest-running, most heavily funded lake restoration efforts of its kind in the country, precisely because Tahoe's clarity became a bellwether that regional leaders decided was worth defending at almost any institutional cost. The fact that this level of sustained investment has only managed to stabilize clarity rather than restore it says as much about the scale of mid-century damage as any fictional barrel field could. TRC Director Stephanie Hampton has been candid in recent reporting that the causes of the Clarity Plateau still aren't fully understood. Researchers are now examining the role of picoplankton, the smallest size class of phytoplankton, and deploying new imaging technology to watch how particles aggregate in the water column in real time, work that continued through 2026. That's the actual frontier of Tahoe science right now. Not barrel fields in the dark, but a genuinely unresolved question about why a 50-year, multi-agency, multi-hundred-million-dollar restoration effort has managed to stop the bleeding without closing the wound. None of this means Tahoe's depths are fully understood or fully surveyed. They aren't. The lake's maximum depth, over 1,600 feet, puts most of its floor well beyond the range of recreational diving, and even beyond most of the ROV work that's been publicly documented. Cleanup, the lake's confirmed survey work, has focused on the shoreline and nearshore zones, out to roughly 55 feet at its deepest current phase. The deep basin, the part of the lake that generated so much fictional intrigue in the viral videos, remains one of the least visually documented large lake bottoms in the country, simply because it's expensive, technically demanding, and not where the organizations with public grant funding and nonprofit budgets have prioritized their dives. That gap between what's known and what's physically down there is real, and it's part of why a fabricated story found an audience so easily. Tahoe's depth has always done double duty in the public imagination, as a source of natural wonder and as a blank space onto which people project whatever they're most afraid might be hiding. That instinct isn't new. Local folklore about a Tahoe monster, sometimes called Tahoe Tessie, dates back well over a century and has never been substantiated by any physical evidence, but it persists precisely because so little of the deep lake has ever actually been seen by human eyes or cameras. What has been documented credibly and repeatedly is more mundane and in its own way more revealing. Decades of ordinary litter, historic automobile parts from an era before anyone thought about environmental impact, and a slow, still not fully explained chemistry of sediment and algae that keeps a world-famous lake from ever fully recovering what it lost 60 years ago. It would be easy to end this by simply debunking a bad YouTube video and moving on. But the actual research and cleanup work happening at Lake Tahoe deserves attention on its own terms, because it's a genuinely useful model for how a place like this can be protected without inventing a crisis to justify it. Cleanup, the lake's shoreline survey, didn't need a barrel graveyard to matter. 25,000 pounds of real debris, pulled out by volunteer divers over years of methodical, unglamorous work, is a meaningful public service on its own, and it's ongoing. Turk's 60-year Clarity dataset didn't need a fabricated drought to be alarming. A lake that has lost nearly 30 feet of visibility since the 1960s and has been unable to fully recover it despite decades of coordinated, well-funded restoration effort is already a sobering story about how hard it is to undo mid-century environmental damage, even when a whole region commits to trying. And the ongoing uncertainty about exactly what's driving the Clarity Plateau, the picoplankton, the fine sediment, the invasive species, is a more honest kind of mystery than anything a fabricated barrel field could offer, because it's one that real scientists are actually working to solve, in public, with data anyone can read. The next time Lake Tahoe's water level drops noticeably, and with the region's precipitation swinging between drought years and heavy snow years, it will expect more shoreline debris to surface, more historic litter, more stories about what divers find. Treat the sensational versions with real skepticism, especially any video making specific claims about named organizations, law enforcement cover-ups, or dramatic droughts you can't find in NOAA or Turk's own public data. And treat the boring, well-documented version with the attention it actually deserves. A lake that really was polluted by post-war development really has spent half a century trying to recover, and still hasn't fully succeeded. Not because anyone is hiding barrels in the dark, but because clearing 60 years of sediment and nutrient loading out of an alpine lake turns out to be one of the hardest environmental problems in America, hiding in plain sight, underwater, so clear you can watch it happen.